It's Halloween on Disney+. Watch frightful family favorites like Hocus Pocus and Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas on Disney+.
I am the Pumpkin King!
Then take the terror to 10 with a thrilling new remake of The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, Scream, and more with Halloween on Disney+. All these and more screaming this Halloween season with Hulu on Disney+. Bundle subscription required. 18+. Select Hulu content via Disney+. Additional content on Hulu app. Terms apply. Visit disneyplus.com/Hulu for details.
This episode is brought to you by Tic Tac. Your boss is going off at you for missing a deadline and you swear the clock just moved backwards. Suddenly, you remember the pack of Tic Tacs on your desk. Now you're riding horseback on the beach, the smell of citrus in the air. And what's this? Your boss is sitting behind you, breathing heavenly fresh mint? Refresh your mouth and mind and share your good vibes with Tic Tac.
Roger, that's over at Get right now, over. Right outside the building.
Welcome to True Spies, Brief Histories. We're living through an era in which the impact of spies, subterfuge, and covert influence is increasingly visible. We're bombarded with news about foreign interference, wartime propaganda, and threats from cyberspace. And that's just for starters. But how did we get here? In these bonus minisodes, we'll explore the long history of spycraft. And with the help of our deep bench of espionage experts, we'll bring you up to speed on the past, present, and possible future of this ancient profession.
What is really interesting is that most exiles, of course, make their way back to the kingdom or the territory where they've come from. When they come back, they say, I can tell you about all of his troops and how he trains them and where he keeps his ships and everything else, right?
I'm Joe Foley, series producer for True Spies. And this is a brief history of Tradecraft. So, there's an autocratic ruler, paranoid in the extreme. He exerts total control over his people, who live in fear of falling foul of his informants. Beyond his nation's borders, networks of spies gather the intel that will, in the likely event of war, grant him a military advantage. Subtle poisons, invisible inks, and secret codes are all part of his tradecraft arsenal. They're deployed frequently and with extreme prejudice. To listeners of True Spies, this is a familiar scenario. We might be behind Stalin's Iron Curtain or at the court of Louis XIV, which is to say really that nothing changes much. Because the person we're talking about is much older than both of those. He's the Pharaoh of Egypt, living more than 1,000 years before the birth of Christ in the 15th century BCE. His name is Thutmose III, an absolute ruler responsible for the governance and expansion of the first real Egyptian empire. That's no easy feat, and it was only possible through intelligence gathering. In line with the available technology of the time, human intelligence was the way to go. Merchants brought court intrigue from the palaces of distant rulers, allowing Egypt to build a picture of their enemy's foreign policy several millennia before the emergence of an embassy cocktail circuit. Within Thutmose's borders, an early police force called the Magi cracked down on dissenters and extracted information through methods that even the most brutal 20th century spy master might have considered heavy-handed. The ancient Egyptians also used a form of encryption, although it's not entirely clear as to whether the strange, non-standard hieroglyphs found on some documents were intended as a means of keeping secrets or just as fun brain teasers. Likewise, scientists have used modern spectrometry to detect special metallic inks used on some surviving papyruses, occupying space on the page that looks, to the casual observer, to be blank. These might have been used to conceal information from readers without proper clearance, or age might simply have faded the pigments to nothing. So many of the mysteries of the pharaoh's espionage are out of reach today, but we can be sure that, when it comes to tradecraft at least, there were no slouches. Well, for a bit anyway. The thing about absolute rulers is that they rule absolutely. So if you're an Egyptian with an interest in having a powerful empire, you might get lucky with someone like Thutmose leading the intelligence charge. Later pharaohs were less adept at this part of the job. which probably contributed to their decline as new powers began to dominate the Mediterranean. Ancient Greece wasn't a single country. Not really. It was more of a loose collection of city-states constantly fighting among themselves, but they would occasionally help each other out, especially when facing a common enemy. One such enemy was Xerxes the Great, ruler of the Persian Empire. In the early 5th century BCE, the Greeks caught wind of a Persian army amassing in the town of Sardis in western Turkey. Sardis was the crossroads between the Greek and Persian worlds and an important trading post as a result. We know from the writings of Herodotus, the world's first historian, that 3 spies were sent to gather intel on the Persian forces under non-official cover as merchants. The story goes that they were caught in the act, brought before Xerxes, and then, surprisingly, given a tour. Xerxes gave the Greek spies a full account of his armed forces and sent them on their way. His logic followed that once the Greeks knew exactly how powerful the Persian army was, they'd roll over, which is psychological warfare at its finest, right? But if we choose to believe Herodotus, Xerxes' gambit didn't work out. When he eventually invaded the Greek mainland in 480 BC, he was met with fierce resistance and eventually repelled entirely. So it's a happy ending for the Greeks, but nonetheless from that story we can glean that ancient Greek spycraft probably wasn't that sophisticated. Because they weren't a unified bloc, there wasn't the same opportunity to build a powerful intelligence gathering network in the manner of the Egyptians, or indeed the Persians. That is, until Alexander the Great united Greece in the 4th century BCE, and much else besides. We know Alexander used spies, but information on how they actually operated is spotty. However, we do have some insight into ancient Greek tradecraft from one of his contemporaries. Around 360 BCE, a soldier called Aeneas Tacticus wrote a handbook called How to Survive Under Siege. Along with the kind of stuff you'd expect in a book by that name, info on battering rams, supply chains, etc., he included a section that gives us a practical insight into some classical tradecraft, primarily to do with the smuggling of secret letters. So here's a few highlights. 1. Secretly insert a letter between the sole and lining of a messenger's shoe. If the road is wet and muddy, write the message on a thin sheet of tin. The messenger never sees the message. Its recipient must go to the messenger while he is sleeping and cut out the letter from his shoe. When the messenger wakes up, he can be given the reply, none the wiser as to what the initial message was. 2. Writings may be conveyed in women's ears, wrapped in thin pieces of lead worn instead of earrings. 3. Find a bladder that sits inside an oil flask. Inflate the bladder, tie it up, and dry it thoroughly. Then write your message on it in ink mixed with glue. When the writing is dried, let the air out of the bladder, squeeze it and push it into the flask, but let its mouth project beyond the lid of the flask. Using the part of the bladder you can still see, blow the bladder up inside the flask. Then, false lining in place, fill it with oil, cut off its projecting end, and fit it to the mouth of the flask so that no one will notice it. Then put a bung in the flask and carry it about openly. The oil will now be plainly seen in the flask, and there will not appear to be anything else in it. When the flask reaches the man for whom it was intended, he will empty out the oil, blow up the bladder, and read the message. And rinse and repeat. It's complicated stuff, but presumably it was effective. Aeneas also mentions a simple cipher, using different patterns of dots to represent vowels. A couple of centuries later, another Greek, Polybius, popularized the Polybius checkerboard, which translates letters into numbered coordinates on a grid. But just as it had for the Egyptians, the Greeks' time in the sun came to an end. Over the course of 3 centuries, the Romans chipped away at the empire built by Alexander the Great. In 30 BC, Octavian defeated Mark Antony and claimed Egypt, the last unoccupied outpost of the Greek Empire, for himself. Octavian, later known as Augustus, would have been no stranger to cryptography. His uncle, Julius Caesar, even has a cipher named after him, the Caesar cipher, believe it or not. That's a simple substitution code, and Caesar used it with a shift of 3, so A became D, B became E, and so on. Look, it's not exactly watertight, but variations on this code are still used today as part of more complex cryptography operations. Greeks aside, Rome's rise to dominance had come in spite of their great rival, Carthage, based out of modern-day Tunisia. The Carthaginian general, Hannibal, was a master of spycraft. His agents, operating inside Rome, used complex hand signals to identify themselves to each other. But if they were caught, they'd have both hands removed before being sent back to Carthage as a warning. We have to assume that the risks were worth it, and if they were, this might be why. Hannibal paid his spies handsomely, using the silver from his mines in Spain. Then, as now, money is one of the purest and most effective tools of tradecraft. We've heard about the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans. So far, so Ancient History 101. But you might be less familiar with a civilization more skilled in the ways of spycraft than any of them, the ancient Vedic kingdoms of India. We know about their methodologies through a Sanskrit work compiled over centuries between roughly the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century CE. It's called the Arthashastra, which translates roughly to statecraft. It lays out the kind of spies employed by a royal court, and it's pretty devious stuff. Here's a taster. One kind of spy is a recluse, initiated in asceticism and possessed of foresight and pure character. This spy, provided with much money and many disciples, shall carry on agriculture, cattle rearing, and trade on the land allotted to him for the purpose. He will use the produce and profits from the land to feed, clothe, and house other ascetics, or holy men. Of these ascetics, he will discover which of them wish to earn a livelihood, and send them out to detect a particular kind of crime in connection with the king's wealth, and report on it when they come to receive their subsistence and wages. All the ascetics under the recluse shall send their followers on similar errands. So what the Arthashastra is talking about here is a handler, whose paid agents are encouraged to cultivate sub-agents. All of them are outwardly humble ascetics, who, supposedly, live a life of deprivation for spiritual gain. In other words, they fly beneath the radar, embedded in society and very well placed to avoid suspicion. Agents like this, able to move freely and motivated by the promise of a more comfortable life, are still vitally important to the business of spycraft. In the centuries before reliable signals intelligence, they were especially useful for gathering long-distance intel. We've already heard about ancient Greek and Egyptian spies disguising themselves as merchants in order to travel further afield, and in the modern era, how many true spies have operated under non-diplomatic cover as business people. But throughout history, there have been other kinds of cover, beyond the commercial or the explicitly state-sponsored. In medieval Europe, for example, there was another group who were prone to dipping their toes into the world of espionage: exiles. On the True Spies debrief, Dr. Jenny Benham, an historian at the University of Cardiff, spoke on that very subject.
So exiles are a very good group of people to think about when it comes to espionage, because exiles are, of course, expelled from the territory where they've been living because they have committed some sort of crime. Very often it's kind of disloyalty to the Lord. And now they are expelled from that territory and they need money, right? They need resources. They need to have something to do, and they need to kind of be able to keep themselves alive. So very frequently they end up going to other kingdoms or other rulers' territories and kind of providing some sort of service. And one of the quickest way of doing that is, of course, to say, I have information. Here it is, right? Very often these people are high status. They are people who are perhaps threatening to a ruler's his governance, for example. They might be claimant to the thrones in a lot of cases. And so one way of finding a way of kind of sustaining their life once they've been expelled is to go and say to another ruler, I have information that you want, or that I can be a military commander for you because I have knowledge of landing places, for example, on the coast or whatever it might be.
Of course, if a spy is motivated by cash alone, trust always comes at a premium.
what is really interesting is that most exiles, of course, make their way back to the kingdom or the territory where they've come from. And now what do? Some of them have been there away for, say, 5, 10, in some cases, even 20 years. And very frequently, when they come back, they say, I tell you what, I know quite a lot about this territory where I've been living, and I can tell you about all of his troops and how he trains them and where he keeps his ships and everything else, right?
Exiles also came in handy when it came to long-term planning. Their cultural insight could be just as invaluable as their military nous. See, if you know when your enemies are most likely to be distracted, you know when to strike.
If you live in a country for 5, 10 or 20 years, you learn the language, you kind of integrate, you learn the culture, and that can also very frequently be useful in terms of espionage. You might also be able to talk to your ruler about specific customs, about when people are celebrating certain things, so that there will be no defense of a city, for example, at certain times of the years, because they might be celebrating a particular feast day in a certain part of a kingdom, and so on and so forth. So those really cultural kind of informations, and they are also extremely valuable. And exiles are really brilliant informers in lots of ways.
As Jenny's explained, most of those exiles would have been of noble birth, gentlemen spies if you like, but low-born agents had their place too. Rulers would often plant spies inside the household staff of those who might threaten their position. Like the humble ascetics of Vedic India, no one suspects a servant.
So we know from 1220, for example, there is a really great letter. It's referred to as a spy report, one of the first espionage reports from medieval England. And it talks about this man who is clearly following the household of a suspected rebel in the reign of King Henry III of England. And he has been planted there by Robert Lexington, who is a kind of middling official, we might think. And it is Robert Lexington who's writing this spy report back to a man called Hubert de Burgh, who is very high up in the king's household. The king, by the way, at this point is a minor. So Robert of Lexington writes this spy report to Hubert de Burgh, who is very high up, one of the top officials in King Henry III's court. And in this spy report, he says that my man is currently tracking one of the people who are suspected of being a rebel. He is following him from basically from Oxford all the way through kind of Nottinghamshire and into Yorkshire and towards the border with Scotland. And Robert of Lexington has received some sort of message from the man that he has planted into the rebels' household. And he is basically acting on that message. And he says, I'm going to go and secure all the castles on the border between England and Scotland to make sure that the rebel is not kind of, able to do us any further harm. And then he says that, fear not, my man is still with the rebels' household, and he is slowing him down by basically making sure that his horses get ill so he can't kind of carry on. So slowing down this kind of rebel and his journey north as it is. And he also says, don't worry, my man will continue to provide reports to me, and so I will keep you informed, basically. So it's a really, really great example of someone that has clearly been planted into the household. And I think it's probably the first clear evidence that we have of that.
Those medieval methods of intelligence gathering were fairly ad hoc, opportunistic even. But by the time of the early modern period, beginning in the 16th century, European state intelligence operations were becoming more formalised and their tradecraft was becoming more sophisticated. One of the big drivers of that development was Sir Francis Walsingham, who you can learn more about in the True Spies episode, Her Majesty's Secret Service. Walsingham was spymaster to Queen Elizabeth I of England. As a Protestant monarch, she was constantly under threat from Catholic insurgents. Walsingham, a devout Protestant himself, used a variety of methods, including torture and execution, to suppress plots against the Queen. But that wasn't always his first port of call. He could be much more subtle than that. And the foiling of the Babington plot is a great example of how. During her reign, a lot of English Catholics thought that Queen Elizabeth's cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, was the rightful heir to the English throne, which Liz I obviously couldn't let stand. In 1585, the Queen imprisoned Mary at Chartley Hall in the English Midlands. Communication with the outside world was strictly prohibited. But her supporters, led by Catholic nobleman Anthony Babington, had figured out a way to keep comms open. They would smuggle coded messages in and out of Chartley Hall inside beer barrels, much in the manner of the siege tactician Aeneas Tacticus over 1,000 years earlier. This was how they planned to keep Mary in the loop with their plan to free her and remove Elizabeth. Unfortunately, one of those plotters was a man called Gilbert Gifford, a Catholic who had been arrested and turned double agent by Walsingham around the same time as Mary was imprisoned. As fate would have it, it was Gifford who was put in charge of smuggling Mary's missives out of Chartley Hall. But before he did that, he made sure they passed under the watchful eye of Walsingham's master codebreaker, a man called John Felipes, before they were resealed and allowed to continue to their intended destination. Walsingham couldn't let the plotters know that he was onto them, not yet, not before he'd given each of them, including poor Mary, enough rope to hang themselves with. In other words, he was building a bulletproof case. Eventually, one of the exchanges between Mary and her supporters included an overt call to assassinate the Queen, which may or may not have been forged by Felipes to strengthen the case against them. So this was his moment. Walsingham swooped and rounded up Babington's conspirators. In 1586, they were hung, drawn and quartered, which for the uninitiated is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. A few months later, Mary Queen of Scots followed them to the scaffold and made her appointment with the executioner's axe. Mission accomplished. Sir Francis Walsingham was also a master of black propaganda, as well as a fan of cryptography and dead letter drops. All the tradecraft that would become de rigueur for the kings, emperors and republics that would vie for power over the next few centuries. And as those centuries wore on, intelligence organisations like his became more and more formalised and more powerful. Codes became harder to break, and new technologies just made the work easier overall. In the 20th century, for example, encrypted radio transmissions allowed agents to make their reports over vast distances. And when that wasn't workable, microdots, or miniature photographs, could be smuggled in far subtler ways than, say, parchment or papyrus. Undercover spies were trained to disappear utterly into their roles, with the benefit of millions of dollars worth of language courses behind them. But still, the fundamentals of espionage tradecraft could probably, after a little explanation, be understood by operatives working hundreds or even thousands of years in the past. And on True Spies, we've told countless stories about that kind of spy work. We tend to round off the year with a little highlights reel of the best stuff. Just look for the episodes named Tradecraft in your podcast feed. But even someone as astute as Walsingham or Tacticus or Pharaoh Thutmose would struggle to wrap their super antiquated noggins around how espionage methodologies are changing today. In a digital world, tradecraft is evolving at a rapid pace.
I remember clearly receiving the file. It was a Friday afternoon, and this report came in from Belarus that they had discovered a piece of software that was very unusual and that was able to spread via USBs.
That's the voice of Liam O'Murku. He and his colleague Eric Chin work in cybersecurity for Symantec. In 2010, they were made aware of a new virus that was designed to target industrial machinery.
It was clear to us from the code that it was physical equipment that was being targeted. We'd never seen this in code before, and it was clear that this piece of software was going to have a real physical damage possibility in the real world. And that was kind of mind-blowing, to be honest with you.
This malware was called Stuxnet, and it was a zero-day exploit. Those are computer worms which target vulnerabilities in software. They're rare, and when they do show up on the black market, they're very expensive.
It started to sink in that this was something that had some geopolitical associations and that was written likely by a government.
We have basically sensors all around the world, and we could see where the infections were popping up all over the world. And while they were all over the world, they were the vast majority coming out of Iran.
Eventually, Liam and Eric realized that this virus was designed to target the centrifuges used to enrich uranium. Iranian uranium. Fun to say, less fun in practice, especially if you're working at the Natanz nuclear facility in Iran at the time. Someone, probably a government, had designed a virus capable of forcing the centrifuges at Natanz to damage themselves, with potentially disastrous results.
We were able to get in touch with some centrifuge enrichment experts, and we told them what we saw happening. So they were able to paint the real-world picture for us of what would happen in that Natanz plant. And what would happen when Stuxnet triggered would be the centrifuges would basically spin up to 1400 hertz and basically go through something called a resonant frequency, where the vibrations would build on themselves at that speed such that the tubes would essentially spin so fast and vibrate so much that they would shatter.
In 2012, the New York Times reported that the Stuxnet virus had been devised as a joint US-Israeli operation, first under George W. Bush and continued under Barack Obama. If you want to learn more about it, search Olympic Games in your True Spies feed. This was sabotage that required little in the way of human tradecraft. One agent with a USB stick could have uploaded it to the Natanz facility's closed computer system. What is the historical equivalent of something like Stuxnet? I suppose Homer's Iliad gives us a neat, if romantic, parallel with its infamous Trojan horse ploy. But as a general rule, this kind of critical strike on an enemy's infrastructure, at so little risk to the person doing it, would have had very little precedent before the digital age. And in our era of increasingly advanced AI, with quantum supercomputers on the horizon, it's never been easier to gather, decrypt, and pass in minutes an amount of information that could fill the Library of Alexandria and then some. Embedding human sources, like those canny medieval servants, is probably less efficient than hacking a smartphone, that ubiquitous, all-seeing, all-hearing window into our private lives. The old ways will always have their place, especially for those who wish to avoid the instant scrutiny of governments and corporations. But the future of tradecraft, we can say with some confidence, will be written in code. If you've enjoyed this much abridged dive into the history of tradecraft, you're in the right place. Since True Spies began in 2020, we've told the stories of World War II infiltrators, FBI undercovers, Cold War tunnel diggers, and many, many more. You can discover them all wherever you get your podcasts. And for an exclusive ad-free experience, including early releases and bonus content, be sure to subscribe to SPYSCAPE Plus at plus.spyscape.com. I'm Joe Foley. Thanks for listening.
Life's full of big money decisions. Dividend versus growth stocks, tapping home equity, even navigating tariffs.
And for every smart tip out there, there's another one that sounds smart but isn't.
That's where NerdWallet's Smart Money podcast comes in. I'm Sean Piles, a certified financial planner professional.
And I'm Elizabeth Ayola. On NerdWallet's Smart Money podcast, our finance journalists do the homework so you can make confident wealth-building moves.
Whether you're building your portfolio or protecting it, we've got the facts and a little fun along the way.
Follow NerdWallet's Smart Money podcast on your favorite podcast app.
Hey folks, get ready for a new season of Blowback coming Monday, September 22nd. This time around, we're covering the Cold War showdown in Africa.
When apartheid South Africa invades the newly independent nation of Angola, revolutionary Cuba sends its own army to defend its African ally, while the United States backs a warlord whose only goal is power.
Subscribe now at blowback.show and get the entire season when it drops, ad-free. Blowback.show.